everybody, welcome to Twisted Pine. Today, as you can see, we got some goodies ready to go in the Twisted truck. So the Twisted F-150 is ready. I got the box you saw in the previous video. It's gonna take this Sundown 12-inch dual 4-ohm voice coil subwoofer, no problem, it's already been fitted. And running it is gonna be this Sundown SFB 1500D, which is a mono block amplifier, meaning it has one channel going out. And this amplifier makes perfectly with this subwoofer, because at dual 4-ohm voice coils wired up to run 2 ohms, you can run this sub either in 4 ohms or 2 ohms. It works perfectly with this amp because this sub's RMS rating is 750 watts. This amplifier's RMS rating at 2 ohms is 750 watts. The 1500 watts comes in at 1 ohm, which means it's stable down to 1 ohm, which is good, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But the reason we're making this video is because I've built systems over the years, usually bigger systems. This is probably the smallest system I've ever built, but I guess I'm getting older and I just want a nice sounding stereo on my F-150 when I'm riding around with Mrs. Twisted Pine. And my old systems were too big. They'd make her heart flutter and gave her all kind of problems, and she just couldn't handle it anymore. And I'm getting older and I don't need all that anymore. I'm not a youngster running around pounding. So this one 12-inch sub is gonna do everything I needed to do. And I'm adding it to the factory system, which sounds pretty good. It just doesn't have the deep bass that I think a system should have in it. So this system installed will work great in that truck. Now the questions I get is, Leslie, how do I know how I should power it? How do I know what I need to put in there? What do I need for my system? It's different for each person, but it basically boils down to 2 things: what you want and what you can afford. Some stereo equipment is cheap. You can buy it cheap, put it in, and you're gonna get possibly a decent sound, not great. And then some stereo equipment is expensive, and it'll do possibly great. It might sound decent as well. So you have to do your research and get good equipment for the good price. I'm going with Sundown. I've used Kicker, I've used Rockford Fosgate. There's a video out there of me and my Jeep Cherokee XJ with 2 15-inch kickers in it, running massive audio amplifiers. This system is going to be full Sundown. Sundown sub, Sundown amp, and later even possibly another amp running 2 Sundown 6x9s. I'm going with Sundown this time because I've never used them before, and I've read about them. I've seen some of their work at the shows, and I wanted to give it a try. So that's what we're going with. But the question comes in, how much does it cost? What do I get? And do your research, buy a brand that you know is going to give you what you're paying for. That means studying the amps and the subs on YouTube, watching what the subs are taking in videos. There's thousands of videos of guys out there testing, thousands of guys out there running amp dynos. So you'll see what real numbers are coming out of the amps. You'll be surprised how many amps will say 1500, 3000 watts RMS, and they're putting out half that amount. You can go to Sundown Unofficial. They have a lot of great amp dyno videos running their amps. And these guys, notorious, just like for Rockford Fosgate and Orion, and some of the better name brand amps, they're beating the numbers displayed on their boxes and what they're saying, usually by quite a bit. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. And that's why I'm trying this Sundown SFB 1500D. It's rated 1500 watts at 1 ohm. I know for a fact from watching videos on the amp dyno that this little amplifier, which is not very big, is beating that 1500 watts by 30 and 40%. I mean, it's just hammering it. Even at the 2 ohm rating, where it's 750 watts RMS, it's going all the way up almost to its rated 1 ohm rating. It's hitting over 1400 watts. Again, you can see that at the Sundown Unofficial. That's insane. That's crazy. It's awesome. I mean, I I have to give it a try. I need to see what it can do. I know that this speaker, even though it's 750 watts RMS, can handle way more. I've seen them run 1,000 watts into it. I know it'll do it. So I'm gonna give it a try. But the next thing you need to determine, once you've decided and picked out an amp, teamed up a good sub that matches and pairs well with it, running whatever resistance you're gonna run in your coils, do the math and make sure, I could have bought a 12-inch subwoofer that had dual 2 ohm coils and ran it at 1 ohm and got all the wattage out of this amp I could get. But there's a reason not to do that later, and I'll tell you why. If you're running your stereo just for the max and you're doing some competition and you just want to have the loudest stereo, by all means, buy those 1 ohm dual 2 ohm voice coils and run them at 1 ohm, and buy the best amp you can get and run it at 1 ohm and get all the wattage you can get out of it. But if you want just a nice sounding system that's really going to put out good bass, sound really good, and you're not wanting to change a lot in your car, like you want to run on your stock battery and your stock alternator, I'll tell you why. Just continue watching. But the next thing, after you have your amp and your sub and the boxes you seen in the previous video, you're going to need this. Oh, yes, that is serious power cable right there. That is 1 aught of positive copper wiring right there. Sweet juice to run your amp. And this thing, let me tell you, this is a good amp. It is, I would say it's not even very power hungry, but it still pulls some amperage. Let me tell you, you need to be able to put some amperage into your amp when that amp is making wattage for your subwoofer. And that's what it's about. Your amp takes all the digital sound that comes from your head unit, it turns that into wattage for your speaker. And to do that, it needs volts and it needs amps. And it needs a lot of it. A lot of volts and a lot of amps. Preferably 14.4 volts. Most cars don't do 14.4 volts. Most cars do 13.5 to 13.9 or 14 volts. So we're gonna do our math in a minute on 13.5 volts. The lowest, or around about the average of what voltage alternators put out. And we're gonna do it based on this sub being at 2 ohms. Because that's what's gonna determine how much amps this amp draws through this wire to make the wattage that makes the speaker go boom. So let's do a little bit of math real quick. I know we all don't like math, but you're gonna need to determine one thing. 2 things really. What size fuse do I need for this cable? And that's gonna come from the manufacturer of the cable. This one came from Crutchfield. It's 1 aught. And I know that this 1 aught copper cable is high quality and it'll handle 300 amps. That's why it has a 300 amp fuse block. That's 2 150 amp mini fuses in there. That makes 300 amps. But that's not what we want to protect this. Because even though this cable can handle 300 amps, which in the future it may need to handle, this, I don't want 300 amps going into this. 300 amps into this amp goes boom. And that doesn't mean that the battery or the alternator pushes always as much amperage as it can into the amp. It's about how much amps the amp draws. And that's based off of how much resistance is in the subwoofer. That's why 4 ohms, 2 ohms, and 1 ohms is really a big deal to you to think about when you're building your system. And you shouldn't sometimes always just go as big as you can if you don't plan on doing future modifications to your vehicle, such as extra batteries or bigger alternators, underdrive pulleys. You can just get really crazy and start, building super powerful high wattage systems that require just, thousands of amps. We're not doing that in the Twisted F-150. We're gonna do a 2 ohm subwoofer into an amp that's able to do 1 ohms, but we're gonna do it light loaded at 2 ohms. We could even go down to 4 ohms, which would be nothing for this amp. 2 ohms is gonna be in its mid-range working performance, it's gonna be putting out some work, and 1 ohm would be, man, it's using the muscle. But we're gonna run it at 2 ohm, because at 2 ohms, it's important to figure this out. Let's say this amp RMS, we'll go off what the book says, is 750 watts. 750 watts. That's a lot of watts RMS into a 12-inch subwoofer. My vehicle has 13.5 volts. You're going to divide that, and that's going to give us 56 or so amps. That's 100% efficiency. That's not what you're going to get. Most amps are usually 80% efficient. That's a good amp. A really good amp is going to be 80 to 85% efficient. I watched amp dynos and got multiple different figures on the SFB 1500D, and it is between, I'd say, 84 to 88% efficiency. Really good. That's phenomenal. This is, I mean, I've done some research. This is a great amp. So that would be 56 amps. Let's say it's not efficient by, you know, a little bit of percentage, and say we needed to use, it was going to draw somewhere around 80 amps just to run the 750 watts RMS. Well, if we were going to do that, we would want to put a 100 amp fuse in there. Well, I don't want to put a 100 amp fuse in there because I know that this amp, from watching online and watching the amp dyno tests, it'll put out 1500 watts. So if we do at 2 ohms, around 1500 watts, 2 ohms, it's 1400 to 1500 watts, 2 ohms, which is, it's rated power just at 2 ohms. And it's rated 1500 watts at 1 ohm, but we know it does way more. So we're going to say 1500 watts divided by 13.5, which is the volts that the alternator in the car puts out, and we're going to get 111 amps. It's hard to write backwards. But 111 amps, we know we're not going to be at 100% efficiency. So what we're going to do is put a 120 amp fuse in for the box. And we know that at 120 amps at 13.5 volts, that's 1,620 watts. That's more than it'll be, but we know the amp will do 2,000 watts at 1 ohm, which means it can handle 1,620 watts at 2 ohms, no problem. The key more then will be how long will the speaker hold up to that. I've seen the tests that say this speaker, even though it's 750 watts RMS, will handle that, no problem. I think they're even rating these at 1,000 watts RMS now, some of the models, versions. So I think the pair is going to be fine. And at 2 ohms, wired to 2 ohms, pulling 111 amps at wide open power usage, I think the car system on a factory battery with a factory alternator will be able to keep up without any problems. We won't have to change any alternators. We won't have to change any batteries. I can run a regular battery in it. I don't have to buy an expensive battery or an expensive alternator to keep up. Pulling 115 amps, continuous pounding, driving around, which I don't do all the time anyway. And the key is to remember that 120 amp fuse protects the amp, not the cable. That's what the 300 amp fuse protects. This cable is run from the battery all the way straight to the amp. This 300 amp fuse is somewhere in the line where this connects to the battery. You're going to cut it close to the battery and install this 300 amp fuse in there. The 120 amp fuse is going to go here, cut here, where this connects into the amp. It's going to be in the line right here. So you'll have another 120 amp fuse here. And that's why you want it there, because that protects the amp. And you're saying, well, why can't the 300 amp? I mean, what does it matter? It's all about the math that we did. And the reason being, you're saying, well, the amp only does that much. I can just put, it's only going to do what it can do. You're right. The amp only does what it does based off of the resistance or the load that's put on it. And this speaker will only put that much resistance in it. So it should never go over its intended wattage or amperage draw. The problem comes when this decides it doesn't want to play anymore. And it decides to disintegrate because you've been pounding it and showing off to your friends, and let's say it's years down the road and you're just hammering, and all of a sudden this whole thing just comes apart. Because anybody that'll tell you their subwoofer will never come apart is lying to you. If you pound a subwoofer hard for years, eventually it's gonna come apart. You can't pound a subwoofer with that kind of wattage and not expect it at some point in its life to give up. That's like having a car and giving it the gas every time you got in it and driving it like you stole it and thinking that it's just gonna last forever. Eventually, something in it's gonna break. And in speakers, that's normally the voice coil. That thing is wound, it's moving in there. Also, it could be the spiders, you know, there's so many things in there that can come apart. And when they touch something and ground out, it goes from a 4 ohm or 2 ohm or a 1 ohm speaker to an infinite speaker, which takes the amp right to its infinite abilities, and it will try to do it. It'll continue, it'll keep sending right up to infinity if it doesn't have something in it to stop it. And that's what the 120 amp fuse is. It stops it before it reaches its maximum level of wattage that it's going to continue to try to create by blowing the fuse and stopping power to it. So when this speaker basically becomes a heater and grounds out, the amp will try to heat the speaker, but when it gets up to its 2,000 watts, 2,500 watts, 3,000 watts, and the amp draw gets from 90 amps to 100 amps to 120 amps, when it hits that 120 amps and so much wattage, it's going to blow the fuse before blowing up the internal components of the amp. So that's everything explained. The key to that is determining also that you want to run at 2 ohms so that you can use your factory components and you don't have the high amperage. I mean, 56 amps is not bad. That's great. You could, any little car could do that. 120 amps, which is about where this will run. My F-150, your F-150, any of them will do it fine with the new alternators and the new batteries. They're putting out lots of amps now. They're not the old 45 amp alternators. They'll run this. And just make sure you're getting a good, really good power. Make sure your inner diameter is really 1/0. A lot of those companies out there, they built cables. They told you it was 1/0. Well, yeah, it was 1/0 on the outside, but the inside was not, and it would not handle the amperage. You know it because when they sent you it, they sent it to you with a 150 amp fuse, and it could only handle half the amperage it should. But a real copper with very little contaminants in the copper, with a lot of strands, that's what makes it flexible. It comes with a good rubber coating, will come with a 300 amp fuse. Do your homework on that. You also want to have a 1/0 ground. Make sure it's good. No fuse needed on the ground. Sound good. Man, my whiskey's been sitting here. I've been neglecting it. So I'm sure people have a different opinion. Put some comments down there. Like and subscribe to Twisted Pine. The channel is mostly about property and clearing and woods and forestry, but we have this section about the Twisted F-150. So if you want to follow along and maybe do the same things to your truck, put it in there. If you don't like it and you think I'm stupid, put it in there. You're a dumb redneck. I don't care. But hey, I hope you enjoy. I hope you learned something, and thanks for watching. Stay twisted.